All right, so you know how it is, you want to stay informed, but it's like drinking from a fire hose.
It really is.
You know, there's so much out there that it can be overwhelming. So for this deep dive, we're going to try to get to the bottom of one particularly knotty problem.
Okay.
It's a significant issue, and we're not going to get lost in the weeds, but we are going to talk about weeds.
Okay.
We're going to talk about Roundup,
Okay.
the weed killer,
Right.
and the allegations that it's linked to some really serious illnesses and what the EPA is doing about all this.
Yeah.
So you had sent me some material from the Ring of Fire YouTube channel.
Yes.
And they're taking a pretty critical look at how this whole thing is unfolding.
They are.
So what we want to do today is really try to understand what are the central arguments that they're making?
Right.
Who are the key players?
Right.
And what could this mean for how companies are held accountable for their products in the future?
Right.
So there's some really heavy stuff at the heart of all this. The reporting that we're looking at, they really emphasize this idea that years of exposure to Roundup has led people to develop non-Hodgkin's lymphoma,
Right.
which is a really serious type of cancer.
Yeah. It's a very serious cancer.
And they don't sugarcoat it. They call it a horrific cancer that results in a slow, ugly death.
Right.
And there's a reason they're talking about that so seriously, because there have been some major legal victories against Monsanto,
Right.
which, you know, is now owned by Bayer
Yes.
with billion-dollar verdicts.
Uh-huh.
So this is a big deal.
It is a big deal.
And a lot of these cases hinge on this idea of failure to warn.
Yes.
Right? It's not just that somebody used a product and got sick.
Right.
It's that the company allegedly didn't properly inform people about the potential risks of developing cancer from using this product.
That's exactly right. So failure to warn means that you as a company have a responsibility to tell your consumers about dangers associated with your product.
Right.
If you know that there are dangers, and in these lawsuits, they're arguing that Monsanto did not meet that obligation.
And this is where things get really disturbing.
Yeah.
Because the transcript we have talks about alleged internal knowledge within Monsanto
Yeah.
that they knew about these risks,
Right.
that their own animal testing showed that there were problems.
Yeah.
And not just in one species. They tested it on rats, monkeys, even beagles.
Right.
And they claimed that this information was intentionally hidden from the public. And they quote one person as saying, all the rats we tested, they all died. All the monkeys we tested, they all died. All the beagles we tested, they all died.
Yeah.
Which is just horrifying to think about.
It's a chilling quote for sure. And if this is substantiated, it really makes you think about, corporations, and if they find out that their products are harmful, what responsibility do they have?
Right.
And there's even alleged internal calculations from Bayer/Monsanto saying, well, this many deaths are acceptable for the product to remain profitable.
That's all.
It really makes you question what kind of value are they placing on human life versus just profit.
Okay, so let's talk about the government's role in all of this, specifically the EPA.
Okay.
Because the perspective we're looking at is very critical of the EPA. They say that the EPA might be working with Bayer to, quote unquote, kill the remaining lawsuits.
Yeah.
That's a big accusation to make.
It's a huge accusation.
So what's the basis for that?
So the big concern is that they're trying to change the rules about lawsuits, and specifically the failure to warn lawsuits.
Right.
So their concern is that if the EPA doesn't label a product as causing cancer, then companies might be able to say, well, hey, the EPA didn't say it causes cancer, so you can't sue us at the state level.
Oh, so it's like a federal rule overruling state law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So even if states wanted to allow these lawsuits because the federal government didn't mandate a warning, they're saying that might not be allowed.
And they also talk about a timeline for how all this allegedly developed.
Right.
They say it started under the Biden administration and has continued under Trump.
Right.
And that it might even speed up.
Right.
And they even make the claim that Biden got huge money from the industry and from law firms that are involved in all of this.
Yeah.
Now, I want to be really clear here.
Yeah.
This is one specific viewpoint.
Yes.
This is what this source is saying.
Right.
We are not saying this is true. We're just reporting on what the source is saying.
Exactly. And it kind of shows you how everything's intertwined, right? You have the regulatory agencies, you have these big corporations, and then you have this political element as well.
Right.
It's a very messy situation.
And it's interesting because they also mention the fact that during the Trump administration, the head of the EPA was a fossil fuel lobbyist.
Yeah.
So they're concerned about what that could mean for regulations, not just on Roundup,
Right.
but on other industries as well in the future.
Exactly. And it's not just Roundup that they're concerned about. They're concerned about what this means for the EPA as a whole.
Yeah.
And their ability to regulate various industries in the future.
And they're very clear about how they feel about the EPA.
Yeah.
They call it the most useless regulatory agency next to the FDA that we have in the United States.
Right.
Again, I want to emphasize,
Yes.
this is a direct quote from the source.
This is a direct quote from the source. So this is one viewpoint, and they are definitely very critical of the EPA.
Okay, so let's look at how the industry is portrayed in all of this.
Okay.
The source does acknowledge that Bayer/Monsanto has said that glyphosate was basically saving the world because it enables us to produce enough food for everyone.
Right.
Which is a pretty big claim.
That's a big claim.
But then the source immediately pushes back and says, no, you were actually destroying farms all over the globe.
Right.
So you can see right there the two very different perspectives.
Yeah. And this is really at the heart of this whole controversy.
Right.
Right? Because on one hand, you have this argument that we need this product for food security.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have these very real concerns about potential health and environmental effects. Right.
And this is what's fueling all the legal battles and the regulatory scrutiny.
The source also tells a story about Bayer's decision to buy Monsanto.
Okay.
And they call it a really foolish move,
Yeah.
especially given all the lawsuits and the financial penalties that were already happening at the time. They even quote someone saying, this idiot that runs Bayer says, hey, I think I'm going to buy Monsanto.
Right. So in their view, Bayer really underestimated the financial and reputational risks that came with all the Roundup litigation.
Yeah.
And it's definitely cost them a lot of money, and it's damaged their public image.
Now things get even darker when the source starts talking about the tactics and the culture within these companies.
Yeah.
They use some pretty strong language.
Right.
They call people involved thugs.
Yeah.
They compare being in depositions with them to dealing with sociopaths and even Ted Bundy.
Wow.
Again, this is a direct quote from the source.
Yes.
Just to be clear.
Very strong opinions.
This is how they're describing it. Yeah, it definitely shows you how contentious these legal proceedings are and how the source feels about the people involved.
And then there's this whole other accusation about companies paying scientists to sign documents saying that the product is safe.
Yeah.
But allegedly they were doing this after the research was already done.
Right.
So it's like they were buying scientific credibility.
Exactly. Trying to create this appearance that all the scientists agree,
Right.
even if the research itself doesn't really back that up.
And this obviously raises some huge questions about, can we trust scientific research?
Yeah.
Especially if it's funded by companies.
Exactly. And what does that mean for the regulatory process if it's based on research that might be biased?
And there's another claim that back in 1991, the EPA actually did link Roundup to cancer.
Oh, wow.
But then the industry allegedly ramped up their lobbying.
Right.
And they only presented research that supported their side of the story.
So basically trying to control the narrative
Yeah.
and influence the regulators to see things their way.
So it's all about power.
It is about power. It's about who has the most influence and how that influences the decisions that are made.
Now, what about the future?
Right.
The source is worried that if these changes to the rules around Roundup go through, it could set a really dangerous precedent for other industries,
Right.
like pharmaceuticals or tobacco.
Exactly.
So they're saying that companies might be able to get away with not warning people about the dangers of their products in a much broader way.
Exactly. And that's a huge concern because if it's harder to sue these corporations when their products cause harm, where does that leave consumers?
Right.
Who's protecting them, especially if the government isn't stepping in to regulate these products?
So to wrap up,
Okay.
we've really tried to dig into this issue with Roundup,
Yeah.
the alleged link to cancer, the legal battles,
Right.
the role of the EPA and the government,
Yeah.
and what it all means for how companies might be held accountable in the future.
Right.
But it's important to remember that we've been looking at this through the lens of one very specific source.
Yes.
They have very strong opinions,
Right.
and we've tried to present those opinions accurately.
Exactly. This is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Right.
And it gives you an idea of how complex and controversial this whole issue is.
Absolutely.
And it's important for listeners to be aware of the different perspectives out there.
So I want to leave you with this.
Okay.
Given everything we've talked about today,
Yeah.
the potential health risks, the legal fights, the fact that the government might be playing a role in all this,
Right.
and the fact that it could affect other industries in the future.
Yeah.
What do you think companies should be doing to make sure that their products are safe?
Yeah.
And to be honest about any potential harms.
That's the big question, isn't it?
And what should the government be doing
Yeah.
to ensure that companies are being transparent and that they're being held accountable?
Exactly.
Especially when you're trying to balance innovation with the need to protect people's health and the economy.
That's a tough one.
It's a lot to think about.
It really is.
So that's our deep dive for today.